All right, let's bring in Courtney Cronin. A lot to talk about. Let's talk about your story, which was fantastic. And I think the biggest takeaway from all of this regarding the hiring of Ben Johnson is Ryan Poles' future. So tell us what you know.
Yeah, so I know there were some things out there in December after Matt Eberflus was fired about Ryan Poles' future and what some people had reported, which was not right, that he was going into the final year of his contract. He's under contract through 2026. And I remember when I was in Minnesota at the time when he was hired here, the day he was hired, the Vikings were still looking for a general manager. And what was reported at that time was that it was a 4-year deal in Minnesota, and the Bears upped the ante, gave him that extra year. So through that logic, and you can confirm it's through 2026, which means he's got 2 more years. This aligns with what Kevin Warren said. Someone asked him a question January 7th, when this was before the process started, when they started bringing in candidates to interview. And it was a question that was phrased along the lines of, like, Poles has another year left. Are you going to extend it? Something along those lines. And he's like, well, there's a lot of assumptions in your question. And I think if you're just, like, listening and trying to figure out between the lines, that told you right then and there that, like, they were, without saying it, because for whatever reason they don't want to say it, that's just typically not how the Bears operate when talking about front office and coaching staff contracts. But that right there should have put some people's antennas up that he wasn't going into the final year of his deal. Now, Ben Johnson has a 5-year contract. It was very lucrative. They ponied up. And, one source I talked to throughout the reporting of the story, first thing they said was Kevin knows how to get people to pay. Like, Kevin Warren came in and changed the process to where they weren't going to shortchange anybody. And when I asked Kevin Warren about, like, just the idea after the Ben Johnson press conference happened of, clearly if you're getting the top guy, you're spending big dollar. And that's before we knew the figure of what's believed to be known as $13 million. And he made a comment about, like, if you want to get the right people, like, you get what you pay for. And they paid for the best candidate this cycle. That was widely felt from a lot of different franchises. And I think all of that being said, I think it shows you just a different way that they're doing business in Chicago as opposed to years past, where different voices, different influences around the McCaskies are getting the job done and getting the job done to a place where it looks very professional, very respectful, and looks like it's going in a different direction.
So do you believe then Ryan Poles is going to then have 7 years left on his deal because of the 2 remaining? And if they're going to put him on the same cycle as Ben Johnson?
They would just give him 3 years then.
I think it would be, when you talk about syncing somebody up, it's the expectation from what I reported that they will have the same timeline. I don't believe that to me. If that's the case, the way that this is usually done, it means that you'd fill in those remaining 3 years.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So he would have 5 left then. I don't know what kind of math I was doing in my head. He would get 5 left.
Yeah, it would be the same timeline. So Ben Johnson's contract starts in 2025 now and goes through 2030. So it would be that same timeline if you're doing it based on the math, based on he's got 2 more years left, and then you'd be adding on 3 to that.
Silvy was doing
I don't know what
math.
I was
He was
thinking.
doing Bulls math is what you were doing over there. So is your expectation, Courtney, that they will announce something fairly soon? Well,
they don't announce these things. Like that's
true.
I don't know. Yeah. I don't know if they're going to go the Bulls route of hiding Billy Donovan's contract, and then we find out 2 weeks after it happened that he got an extension. I haven't covered the team since they did an extension for anybody. So I have always kind of felt that these things are very quiet in Chicago. It's something that that's always the way they go about business when you ask them publicly about it. But I would imagine these things happen in the off season, and it's been pretty busy, and they've got at least they've got their coaching staff mostly in place right now. And so I would imagine once you let the dust settle from that, it's an off season move. I don't believe it's something that, you'd imagine that it gets done before training camp. And I know that seems like a long way away, and that does give them quite a bit of wiggle room to figure out how and when to do this. But yeah, it is the expectation that he will be extended at some point, within the not too distant future.
Courtney, what are your thoughts on how they've filled out their coaching staff?
Ben Johnson's getting experienced coaches. Like he said, he wanted to. Like, even with the Dennis Allen thing to start last week when that becomes official, and now, with Dan Rauscher and, Eric Bieniemy, both of those guys have multiple years of NFL coaching experience. And I've already kind of like looked into, I was trying to like calculate, if you look at how many years of playing experience, coaching experience, a lot of the people have on the offensive side of the staff, it's pretty substantial. From Antoine Randall, who's done this as a player and now as a coach, to, arguably the most important position on the offensive side of the ball, which is your O-line. Think about how many Pro Bowl and first team All-Pro offensive linemen Rauscher had in New Orleans. Like, that's a good pedigree. And I think it's more than just, because we talked a lot about getting the right fit in for the offensive line. That means right players, but I also think it needs to be coached in a different way, because there was a regression last year on the offensive line when the depth was supposed to be better, when guys were supposed to have taken another step, and it felt like that unit took a step back. So it's more than just having the right personnel. It's having the right coaching tools in there to get guys to their highest potential. And that's what's going to be important for Ben Johnson in the next couple of months, like teaching his coaches, because a lot of these people, outside of JT Barrett and Antoine Randall, like a lot of these other coaches have never coached under Ben Johnson before. So he's going to have to teach them how he wants it done, to a point that it isn't like training camp and the coaches are still coaching each other. Like, they've got to figure that out in the next couple of months, OTAs. So by the time minicamp comes around, they're feeling pretty good about how they're instituting their coaching principles on this team. And you have people with a lot of experience doing that. Eric Bieniemy's coached running backs a lot in his career. I was not surprised to see that name pop up, just because of how much overlap he had with Kevin Warren in Minnesota, and then with Ryan Poles throughout Poles' entire time, more or less, in Kansas City. And that's the right approach for them to take for a first-year head coach who's going to have so much on his plate that he's going to need guys that he can walk away from the running backs room and know they're being coached the way that he needs them to be coached, because he can trust that Eric Bieniemy will do it just the way that he'll trust that other position coaches will coach their guys.
I want to ask you about Bieniemy because I love that he is the running backs coach, but a lot of people have always called the show and they go, what about Eric Bieniemy for the head coach? What about Eric Bieniemy for the offensive coordinator? And in 2022, when Poles was hired, I don't believe he interviewed Bieniemy for the head coaching job, and he knew him. And then when he had a chance, I believe, to interview him for the OC job before he went to UCLA, I don't think he interviewed him either. Why do you believe he's sort of fallen off the radar as an OC and as a head coaching candidate, and has now been is going to be a position coach?
Well, I can tell you what I know, because there's always going to be people who speculate, he doesn't interview well. They've heard that. Okay, well, I'd love to hear the people who are actually in the rooms who have been in there with Eric Bieniemy. What I know from talking with players, with talking from coaches who have coached with him, is that he's an incredibly demanding coach, a damn good coach at that, too. Like, Adrian Peterson loved him as his position coach, for as much as those two early on in his career in Minnesota nearly came to blows. Like, he demanded a ton out of him, and especially those early seasons where he was, the best running back in the league or close to it until he got to his MVP season. He'd be the first one to tell you that Eric Bieniemy was a big part of that. But I think, there is some stuff about, the collaboration effort, maybe being a little bit on the stubborn side that, as an offensive coordinator, we remember what Ron Rivera kind of said out in the open. I'm sure he didn't really mean to say that in 2023, that, some players were coming to him complaining about Eric Bieniemy as the offensive coordinator, asking for too much in Washington. I think the way to deliver the message that maybe doesn't work well with every player that he's around, but we know that he's a really good coach. It's just, I think a position coach, that role will be good for him. I think just based on what I know and speaking with players who have been under him before, whether it's as an OC or in the running back room, that they respect him as a coach. I think it'll be really good for him to focus in on one position, for honestly a position group that needs it. That they spent a lot of money on DeAndre Swift. They got to start getting the return on investment at some point. Roschon Johnson is a fourth-round pick who has been injured, and we don't know where's his ceiling? What is his potential? And whatever else they do to fill out that room, knowing how important the run game is to Ben Johnson's, like the explosiveness of that offense doesn't just start from the pass game. Like they were a really good rushing offense because of Montgomery and Gibbs. Like, how do they get a version of that here? That's a huge responsibility and burden on Eric Bieniemy to bring to the light.
And with that as a backdrop, Courtney, I was going to ask you, there have been several, very, very, very early for mock drafts, but whether it's Ashton Genty or the kid from UNC, like, do you see, speaking about running backs and what Ben Johnson likes to do with the focus on the running game, would you be surprised if they spent one of their first 3 picks inside the 41, I think it is, on a running back?
Yeah, I'd be surprised if it's the first one, the one at 9. Like that's, I don't know. I've seen people's mock drafts. I've seen what the buzz is coming out of the Senior Bowl and how people are using that to, position forward what their priorities are. I still think that offensive line, defensive line are such pressing needs that you can't go outside of those until they are addressed. There might be other ways for them to do that. I mean, Myles Garrett just requested a trade.
Yeah.
The Bears should be calling Cleveland,
That's
even though
what
Cleveland's like, we're
them.
not trading him. Like, call them. The guy had 14 sacks in back-to-back years. Like he's 29 years old. Like if they made the move for Khalil Mack when they did, and I know it was a completely different front office, but like the same sort of principle. If a player like that is available, and even if they're not, and they say they're unhappy and they want out, you explore that. But like I say that to bring up, well, then maybe that alleviates a need if they let's say. Like if you played that out and they somehow landed him via a trade, if they had some extra picks to work with, I don't think it's wrong to upgrade the run game and finding a guy that might be a better fit in Ben Johnson's offense. But there's also the need for a speedy number 3 receiver. That's, if you're looking at free agency priorities, guys that might be back, guys that might not, it would lead you to believe that Keenan Allen's probably not coming back just because of not that he's a bad player, but just because of the age, the foot and everything else and the cost. There's a lot of priorities that this team's got to figure out over the next couple of weeks as they go to the combine. Like this is a time where teams that aren't in the postseason or in the Super Bowl are in draft meetings. And there's a lot of work to be done to figure out who they like from like the college game, who they like in free agency, and then putting their priorities in line there. But I just don't think running back is the top priority right now when there are so many more obvious areas with the pass rush and with especially the interior of the offensive line that need to be addressed.
Let's expand on the Myles Garrett conversation. Let's say Cleveland does become open to trading him, to moving him. How realistic is it that the Bears could go all in on a Myles Garrett deal? And could they afford both him and Montez Sweat the money?
Well, they've got $80 million in cap space, an estimated $80 million this year. So factoring that in, Garrett's got 2 years left on his deal. He doesn't come at a discount. He doesn't deserve to come at a discount. Like the guy's an incredible pass rusher. He's worth every penny. They've got 4 picks in the top 72, I believe, and of course there's the extra second from Carolina. I've seen this kind of floating around places. Like, what's the comp? Comp's probably what they paid for Khalil Mack when they got him here at 27 years old in 2018. So that's multiple first-round picks. I think, it kind of brings it back to the extension part and the expectation that happens for Ryan Poles. I think you make that move if you feel that you've got this extra security to see it through. You know what I mean? And it's not a desperation sort of move. It's not a panic. It's not like we saw the last front office in a completely different situation, but like trading up to go get a quarterback to save everybody's jobs when they were fired the next year. It's not bad. I think if you have that extra security, it emboldens you to be a little bit, I wouldn't say risky, but like to spend big, to do big moves like that. And we know that he hasn't shied away from that. He's, dealt with the number 1 pick in the last 2 years, used it 1 year and then traded it for a haul the year before. He's traded away a quarterback who had, potential but wasn't on their timeline. I don't think that anybody could look at the Bears and say, I know I've seen some of the odds, like them having maybe like the 5th or 6th best odds the initial ones to land Myles Garrett. They're aggressive, and they've shown you as a front office that they will be aggressive, and whether it happens or not, I think obviously Cleveland has something to say about that. But it's going to depend on how many first-round picks the Browns are asking for. Because remember, this year is the first time that they are able to use one when they, probably go draft Abdul Carter because of the Deshaun Watson trade. So they're going to be in the market looking for some first-round picks because they haven't had them the last couple of years, which probably drives the price up a little bit more.